What happens when hatred meets courage in the darkness? Tonight we uncover a story that will leave you speechless, a tale of veterans, valor, and the price of freedom that few dare to tell. Before we begin this incredible journey, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss stories like this one. The autumn of 1919 painted the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and crimson. But for the residents of Freedman's Haven, the colors represented something far more precious than seasonal beauty. They symbolized the harvest of their first truly free year. Nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak trees, the villa that crowned the settlement stood as a testament to what former slaves could accomplish when given the chance. Built with their own hands from local stone and timber, the three-story mansion wasn't just a home, it was a declaration. Its wraparound porch faced the main road defiantly, as if daring the world to question their right to prosperity. The villa's construction had taken 3 years, with every nail hammered by free hands, every board cut by men who worked for wages rather than whips. The foundation stones had been quarried from the same hills where some of these men had once hidden as runaway slaves. The timber came from trees they'd felled themselves, each ring marking years of bondage transformed into years of hope. The intricate woodwork around the windows and doors bore the craftsmanship of men who'd learned their trades in secret, practicing carpentry and masonry in stolen moments between cotton rows. Samuel Washington, a man whose surname carried the weight of irony and pride in equal measure, stood on that very porch as the sun began its descent. At 62, his hair had turned silver, but his back remained straight, a posture earned through decades of defying those who expected him to bow. The scars on his hands told the story of his youth in bondage, but the deed in his pocket told the story of his triumph. The porch where Samuel stood had been designed with intention. Its height elevated him above any man on horseback, a subtle but deliberate reversal of the power dynamics he'd known all his life. The columns, painted brilliant white, could be seen for miles, a beacon announcing that free people lived here, prospered here, and would not be moved from here. "Papa Sam, you see them riders coming up the valley road?" The voice belonged to Marcus, Samuel's grandson, whose 24 years had been split between the cotton fields of his childhood and the battlefields of France. Marcus had returned from the Great War 3 months ago, carrying medals in his duffel bag and nightmares in his sleep. His uniform hung in the closet pressed and ready, though he'd sworn never to wear it again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought for democracy abroad while his own people were denied basic rights at home. Marcus bore the invisible wounds that many veterans carried. He'd seen poison gas turn men into writhing, choking corpses. He'd watched friends die in muddy trenches thousands of miles from home, fighting for freedoms they couldn't enjoy in their own country. The French had treated him as an equal, a hero even. But returning to Virginia had been a harsh reminder that his uniform meant nothing to those who saw only the color of his skin. Samuel squinted toward the horizon, where dust clouds marked the approach of horsemen. "I see them, boy. Question is what they want with us at this hour." The villa buzzed with the quiet activity of evening routines. In the kitchen, Martha Washington, Samuel's wife of 43 years, supervised the preparation of dinner for the 12 families that called Freedman's Haven home. The aroma of cornbread and stewed chicken filled the air, mixing with the laughter of children playing in the yard. Martha had been born into slavery, on the same plantation as Samuel. But her memories of bondage were tempered by her pride in what they'd built together. She'd learned to read in secret, teaching herself from a Bible she'd found hidden in the master's library. Now she taught Sunday school in the settlement's church, watching children learn openly what she'd had to steal in darkness. These children had never known slavery. They attended the school that Samuel and the other founders had built with their own hands, learned to read from books purchased with money earned through honest labor, and fell asleep each night without fear of being sold away from their families. This was the dream that had sustained Samuel through the darkest years of bondage, a place where his people could live with dignity. The settlement itself was a marvel of planning and determination. Each family had their own plot of land, their own home built to their specifications. The main street was lined with businesses, a general store, a barber shop, a seamstress shop, even a small bank where residents could save their earnings without fear of theft or arbitrary confiscation. Gardens flourished behind every home, and livestock grazed in carefully tended pastures. But dreams, Samuel had learned, required constant vigilance to protect. "Marcus, go fetch Thomas and the others," Samuel said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Tell them to come casual-like, but tell them to come armed." Thomas Jefferson Brown, another man whose name carried historical weight, lived in the cabin closest to the main house. At 58, he'd been Samuel's friend since childhood, when they'd worked the same plantation under the same overseer's whip. Unlike Samuel, who'd bought his freedom through years of saving every penny, Thomas had escaped during the chaos of the Civil War and made his way north to join the Union Army. The war had changed Thomas. He'd returned with sergeant's stripes, a Purple Heart, and an unshakable belief that freedom was something you fought for, not something you asked for politely. His cabin was strategically positioned to overlook the main road, a choice that hadn't been accidental. Thomas had learned military tactics the hard way, in battles where the difference between victory and defeat was often measured in yards of blood-soaked ground. As Marcus made his rounds, other men began to appear on porches and in doorways. There was Isaiah, the blacksmith, whose massive frame filled his workshop entrance. His hands, permanently stained black from his trade, rested casually on the hammer at his belt. Beside him stood his son David, recently returned from the Western Front, where he'd served with the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. Isaiah's workshop was more than just a place of business. It was the settlement's armory. In addition to horseshoes and farming tools, he crafted weapons and ammunition for the community's defense. His forge had been built with military precision, designed to produce not just the implements of peace, but the tools of war when necessary. From the schoolhouse came Professor William Hayes, a man whose education had been earned in secret during slavery and refined at Howard University after emancipation. At 45, he was the youngest of the community's leaders, but his wisdom commanded respect. He'd seen what education could do for his people, and he'd also seen what ignorance and hatred could do to destroy it. Professor Hayes carried himself with the dignity of a man who understood the power of knowledge. His library, housed in the schoolhouse, contained over 300 books, volumes on history, science, literature, and law that he'd collected over years of careful saving. He believed that education was the ultimate weapon against oppression, but he also understood that sometimes more immediate forms of defense were necessary. The riders were closer now, close enough to count. 12 men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats, their intentions hidden beneath a veneer of casual purpose. But Samuel had lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by appearances. The way they rode in formation, the way their hands rested near their weapons, the way their eyes swept the settlement with calculating precision, all spoke of men who'd come for violence. "Evening, boys," Samuel called out as the riders approached the villa's front gate. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of a man who'd learned to navigate dangerous waters. "Y'all seem to be riding mighty late. Something I can help you with?" The lead rider, a man whose expensive clothes couldn't quite hide the cruelty in his pale eyes, urged his horse forward. "Name's Clayton Whitmore," he announced, as if the name should carry weight. "I represent certain interests in the county. We've been hearing stories about this place of yours." Whitmore was known throughout the region as a man who'd made his fortune through intimidation and violence. His plantation had been one of the largest before the war, and he'd never accepted that his world of absolute power over other human beings had ended. He'd spent the years since Reconstruction organizing resistance, funding terror campaigns, and dreaming of a return to the old order. "Stories?" Samuel's voice remained level, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the rifle leaning against the porch railing. "What kind of stories would those be, Mr. Whitmore?" "Stories about uppity coloreds who've forgotten their place," Whitmore replied, his mask of civility slipping. "Stories about a bunch of former slaves who think they can live like white folks in a house that belongs in the hands of proper people." The silence that followed was pregnant with danger. Samuel could feel the tension radiating from the men positioned around the property, his friends, his family, his community. They'd all heard words like these before, in different times and places, usually followed by violence. But this wasn't 1859, and these weren't the same men who'd once worn chains. "Mr. Whitmore," Samuel said slowly, "I've got the deed to this property right here in my pocket, bought and paid for with money I earned through honest work, same as any man has the right to do in these United States of America." Whitmore's laugh was ugly. "Rights? You think you've got rights?" He gestured to his companions, and Samuel noticed for the first time the rope coiled around one man's saddle horn, the torches tied to another's pack. "We're here to remind you what happens to coloreds who get too big for their britches." From the shadows of the porch, Marcus stepped forward. The medals on his chest caught the dying light, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, the Croix de Guerre from the French government. His uniform was crisp, his bearing military, his eyes hard as flint. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led troops into battle, "I believe you're mistaken about something." Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he took in the uniform, the medals, the unmistakable bearing of a combat veteran. "What's that, boy?" "We're not the same people you think we are," Marcus replied, "and this isn't the same place you think it is." As if summoned by his words, other figures began to emerge from the gathering darkness. Thomas appeared from behind the oak tree, his own military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. Isaiah stepped out of his workshop, and the dying light of his forge silhouetted his massive frame. David materialized from the shadows near the schoolhouse, and Professor Hayes emerged from the villa's front door. One by one they revealed themselves, not as the frightened former slaves that Whitmore had expected to find, but as something else entirely. Something that made the horses nervous and their riders shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice now carrying a different tone entirely, "I believe it's time you moved along. This is private property and you're not welcome here." Whitmore's face flushed red with anger and something else, something that might have been the first stirring of fear. "You think we're afraid of a bunch of—" "Mr. Whitmore," Professor Hayes interrupted, stepping into the light. His voice carried the measured cadence of an educated man, but underneath it was steel. "I suggest you consider your next words very carefully. You see, we've all heard talk like yours before. The difference is, we're not the same men who had to listen to it in silence." The standoff stretched into the gathering darkness, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Samuel could see Whitmore calculating, weighing his options, trying to decide if his hatred was stronger than his survival instinct. Finally, Whitmore pulled his horse's reins, backing away from the gate, but his eyes promised that this wasn't over. "We'll be back," he snarled, "and next time we'll bring enough men to finish what should have been finished years ago." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Samuel felt the weight of what was coming. This had been a reconnaissance, a test of their resolve. The real attack would come later when Whitmore had gathered more men and more courage. But as he looked around at the faces of his community, at the veterans who'd survived the Western Front, at the men who'd built something beautiful from nothing, at the children who'd never known slavery, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt ready for a fight. The emergency meeting convened in the villa's main parlor as midnight approached. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating faces that bore the weight of hard decisions. Samuel sat at the head of the long table he'd crafted himself, while the other community leaders arranged themselves around him like a council of war. The parlor itself told the story of their journey from bondage to freedom. The furniture, handcrafted by men who'd learned woodworking in secret, bore the marks of tools wielded by free hands. The walls displayed photographs of the settlement's construction, images of families reunited after years of separation, and portraits of children born into freedom. But tonight, these symbols of hope were overshadowed by the grim necessity of planning for war. "They'll be back," Thomas stated flatly, cleaning his service revolver with practiced efficiency. "Question is when and how many they'll bring with them." Thomas's hands moved with the automatic precision of a man who'd maintained weapons under fire. His revolver, a Colt .45 he'd carried through the Civil War, bore the scars of battle, but remained deadly accurate. He'd kept it clean and ready for 54 years, hoping he'd never need it again, but knowing that hope was often a luxury free men couldn't afford. Marcus paced near the window, his military training evident in every movement. Whitmore's type doesn't make idle threats. He's probably riding to every plantation and mill in the county right now, calling in favors and stirring up hate. The young veteran's mind was already working through tactical scenarios, drawing on lessons learned in the trenches of France. He'd seen how quickly civilized men could become savage when their worldview was threatened. The war had taught him that evil didn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It came wearing familiar faces, speaking familiar words, wrapped in the flag of righteousness. Professor Hayes spread a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area across the table. We need to think strategically. Freedman's Haven sits in a natural bowl, surrounded by hills. Tactically, it's defensible, but only if we're prepared. The map was a work of art and science, meticulously drawn over months of careful observation. Hayes had walked every trail, measured every distance, noted every natural feature that could provide cover or concealment. His academic mind had approached the problem of defense with the same methodical precision he brought to teaching mathematics. Isaiah, whose massive hands dwarfed the coffee cup he held, spoke in his rumbling bass voice. My boy David counted at least 12 riders tonight, but if Whitmore's serious about finishing what should have been finished, he'll bring more, maybe a lot more. The blacksmith's workshop had become an unofficial intelligence center, with David and other young men taking turns as lookouts from the forge's high windows. They'd been tracking the movements of suspicious riders for weeks, noting patterns and building a picture of the growing threat. Isaiah's military experience from the Civil War had taught him the value of good intelligence, and he'd passed that lesson on to his son. The room fell silent as each man contemplated the implications. They'd all lived through the terror campaigns that had followed Reconstruction, the midnight raids, the burning crosses, the bodies hanging from trees as warnings to others who might dare to dream of equality. They'd thought those days were behind them, but hatred, it seemed, was patient. Samuel broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Before we go any further, I need to know, are we all committed to this? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. Win or lose, they'll never leave us alone after this. The question hung in the air like smoke from Isaiah's forge. Each man understood what Samuel was really asking. Were they prepared to die for what they'd built? Were they ready to transform their peaceful settlement into a fortress? Were they willing to teach their children that freedom came at the price of eternal vigilance? Tell me about the men we have, Samuel said, turning to Marcus. The veterans. Marcus pulled out a notebook and flipped through pages covered with neat handwriting. Counting myself, we've got 14 men with military experience. 7 served in France with various colored regiments. 3 fought in the Philippines. 4 are Civil War veterans, including Thomas and Papa Isaiah. Each name in Marcus's notebook represented a story of service and sacrifice. Jerome Williams had earned the Purple Heart at Belleau Wood, where he'd held a machine gun position for 6 hours against repeated German assaults. Benjamin Carter had survived the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American battle of the war, where he'd served as a runner, carrying messages through artillery barrages that killed men by the thousands. Isaiah fought? Professor Hayes looked surprised. The old blacksmith's weathered face creased into a grim smile. 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Fought at Fort Wagner with Colonel Shaw. Lost a lot of good men that day, but we proved something important, that colored soldiers could fight and die as well as any white man. Isaiah's memories of Fort Wagner were still vivid after 56 years. He could still hear the rebel yell of Confederate defenders, still smell the gunpowder and blood, still feel the weight of his musket as he charged up the beach toward the fortress walls. The assault had failed, but it had proven that black men would fight for their freedom with courage, equal to any soldiers in history. Thomas nodded respectfully. I was with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, rode with the Army of the Potomac from 63 to the end, saw action at Petersburg and Richmond. The cavalry had been Thomas's salvation and his education. He'd learned to read and write in camp, taught by a white officer from Boston who believed that literacy was as important as marksmanship. He'd learned tactics and strategy from sergeants who'd fought in Mexico and against the Indians. Most importantly, he'd learned that a man on horseback with a rifle was the equal of any other man, regardless of the color of his skin. And the younger men? Samuel asked. David served with the 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters, Marcus continued, spent more time in combat than any American unit in the war. Jerome was with the 371st, saw action at Champagne-Marne and Meuse-Argonne. Benjamin and Robert served with the 92nd Division in the Argonne Forest. The 369th Infantry Regiment had become legendary among black soldiers, assigned to fight with the French army because white American units refused to serve alongside them. They'd earned the respect of their French comrades and the fear of their German enemies. They'd spent 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit, and had paid for their valor with blood. Samuel absorbed this information, his mind working through possibilities. What about weapons? That's where we might have a problem, Thomas admitted. Most of us kept our service weapons, but ammunition's scarce, and if Whitmore brings as many men as I think he will... The veterans had indeed kept their weapons, despite official orders to turn them in. They'd learned not to trust that the government would protect them, and they'd seen too much violence in the years following the war to believe that their service guaranteed their safety. But keeping weapons was one thing, keeping them supplied with ammunition was another. I might be able to help with that, Professor Hayes interjected quietly. All eyes turned to him in surprise. The scholarly man seemed an unlikely source for military supplies. During the war, I worked with the War Department, helping to coordinate supplies for colored regiments, he explained. I still have contacts, men who believe in what we're trying to build here. Men who understand that the war for freedom didn't end in France. Hayes's contacts were a network of white officers and government officials who'd served alongside black troops and had been changed by the experience. They'd seen courage under fire, witnessed sacrifice for the cause of democracy, and had come to understand that the fight for freedom was far from over. Some held positions in the military bureaucracy, others worked in munitions factories, and a few had access to surplus weapons and supplies. Marcus stopped pacing and fixed his grandfather with a steady gaze. Papa Sam, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Samuel nodded. Are you prepared for what this might cost? Because if we fight, really fight, some of us might not see morning, and even if we win, they'll never leave us alone after that. The question forced Samuel to confront the terrible arithmetic of resistance. Every man who died defending Freedman's Haven would leave behind a family, children who would grow up without fathers, wives who would face the world alone. Every bullet fired in anger would echo through generations, creating cycles of violence and retribution that might never end. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. Boy, I was born into slavery in 1857. I spent the first 8 years of my life believing that I was property, that my mama, my daddy, my brothers and sisters were all just things that could be bought and sold like cattle. When the war came, I thought freedom meant just not being owned anymore. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the community he'd helped build. But freedom isn't just about not being owned. It's about having something worth protecting. It's about being able to look your children in the eye and tell them they can be anything they want to be. It's about building something beautiful and saying, this is ours and we earned it. Samuel turned back to face the room. I've spent 62 years on this earth, and most of them fighting for the right to be treated like a human being. I'm too old to start running now, and I'm too proud to start begging. Thomas stood and placed his hand on his friend's shoulder. Then we fight. One by one, the other men rose and voiced their agreement. Isaiah's deep voice rumbled his assent. Professor Hayes adjusted his spectacles and nodded firmly. Marcus straightened to attention and saluted his grandfather, not in mockery, but in respect for a decision that required the courage of a soldier. All right then, Samuel said. Let's talk about how we're going to survive this. The next several hours were spent in detailed planning. Marcus sketched defensive positions based on his military training, while Thomas shared hard-won wisdom about guerrilla tactics from his cavalry days. Professor Hayes outlined potential escape routes for the women and children, and Isaiah calculated how many weapons his forge could produce before dawn. The plan that emerged was complex and dangerous, but it played to their strengths. They would use the terrain to their advantage, forcing attackers into predetermined kill zones. They would rely on superior marksmanship and discipline to offset numerical disadvantage. Most importantly, they would fight as free men defending their homes, not as slaves cowering before their masters. As the first hints of sunrise began to lighten the eastern sky, a plan had emerged. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it was theirs. "One more thing," Samuel said as the meeting began to break up. "We need to give the families a choice. Anyone who wants to leave, women, children, men who don't want to fight, they go now before this gets ugly." "And if they choose to stay?" Marcus asked. Samuel's smile was grim but determined. "Then we show Mr. Whitmore and his friends what happens when you corner people who've got nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for." As the men dispersed to their homes to catch a few hours of sleep before the day's preparations began, Marcus lingered behind with his grandfather. "Papa Sam, can I ask you something?" "Course, boy. In France we fought for democracy, for freedom, for the right of people to determine their own destiny. But when we came home, we found that those rights didn't extend to us. Why are we fighting for a country that doesn't want us?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "Marcus, we're not fighting for a country. We're fighting for an idea. The idea that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The fact that this country hasn't lived up to that idea yet doesn't make the idea wrong. It makes the country incomplete." He gestured toward the window, where the first residents of Freedman's Haven were beginning their morning routines. "What we've built here, this is what America is supposed to look like. And if we have to fight to protect it, then we're not fighting against America. We're fighting for it." As Marcus headed home to prepare for what might be his last day on Earth, he carried his grandfather's words with him. They'd fought for democracy in France, and now they'd fight for it at home. The enemy might look different, but the cause was the same. Freedom was never free, and some things were worth dying for. Dawn broke grey and ominous over Freedman's Haven, as if the sky itself sensed the violence to come. By 6 o'clock, the community had transformed from a peaceful settlement into something resembling a military encampment, though one where children still played in the yards and women still hung laundry on the lines. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Men moved with purpose rather than leisure, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and every adult carried themselves with the heightened awareness of people preparing for battle. Yet life continued. Breakfast was cooked, animals were fed, and the normal rhythms of community life provided a thin veneer of normalcy over the growing tension. Marcus stood in the villa's front yard, watching as families made their impossible choices. The Hendersons, a young couple with 3 small children, loaded their possessions into a wagon, tears streaming down the wife's face as she kissed Martha Washington goodbye. They would head north to relatives in Philadelphia, carrying with them the hope that someday they might return to the home they'd helped build. The decision to leave was agonizing for every family that made it. These weren't cowards fleeing danger. They were parents making the impossible calculation between principle and protection. Mary Henderson had been born in slavery and had sworn her children would never know that fear. But she also understood that dead parents couldn't protect anyone, and the sight of her 3-year-old daughter playing with a corn-husk doll made the choice clear. But for every family that chose to leave, another chose to stay. The Johnsons, whose teenage son had been born in the villa, declared that they'd rather die free than live in fear. The Williams family, led by a grandmother who'd survived slavery, Reconstruction, and the birth of Jim Crow, announced that she was too old to start over and too stubborn to give up. Grandmother Williams, at 78, had seen more history than anyone in the settlement. She'd witnessed the end of slavery, the promise of Reconstruction, and the bitter betrayal of Jim Crow. She'd buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children, and she'd be damned if she'd let a bunch of night riders drive her from the home she'd helped build with her own arthritic hands. By noon, the population of Freedman's Haven had been reduced from 48 souls to 31, 22 adults and 9 children, who decided that some things were worth the ultimate sacrifice. The children who remained seemed to sense the gravity of the situation without fully understanding it. They played their games more quietly, stayed closer to their parents, and asked fewer questions than usual. The older ones, those approaching their teenage years, had been given simple tasks to help with the preparations: carrying water, organizing supplies, and serving as messengers between the defensive positions. Professor Hayes had worked through the night, using his contacts to secure additional weapons and ammunition. A wagon had arrived before dawn, driven by a white man whose Union Army uniform bore the insignia of a colonel. He'd spoken briefly with Hayes, unloaded several crates, and departed without giving his name, though Marcus noticed the man's respectful nod toward the villa before he left. The colonel was James Morrison, a career officer who'd commanded black troops in France and had been disgusted by the treatment they'd received upon returning home. He'd seen the 369th Infantry fight with courage that shamed their white counterparts, and he'd made a personal vow to support them however he could. His position in the War Department gave him access to surplus weapons, and his conscience demanded that he use that access to help men who'd served their country with honor. The crates contained a treasure trove: Springfield rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, and something that made Thomas whistle in appreciation: a Lewis machine gun, complete with ammunition belts and a tripod mount. The Lewis gun was a weapon that Marcus recognized from his service in France. British designed but American manufactured, it was capable of firing 500 rounds per minute and had been the backbone of Allied defensive positions throughout the war. In the hands of an experienced operator, it could hold off an entire company of attacking infantry. Where in hell did Hayes get his hands on military hardware like this? Isaiah asked, examining one of the rifles. Better not to ask too many questions, Thomas replied. But I'm guessing our professor has friends in higher places than we knew. The Springfield rifles were the same model that Marcus and the other veterans had carried in France. They were accurate, reliable, and deadly in the hands of men who knew how to use them. Each rifle came with a bayonet and 200 rounds of ammunition, enough for a sustained firefight. The defensive preparations had been methodical and thorough. Marcus had positioned riflemen in carefully chosen locations around the property, taking advantage of natural cover and creating interlocking fields of fire. The Lewis gun was mounted in the villa's second-story window, where it commanded a clear view of the main approach road. The positioning of each defender had been calculated with mathematical precision. Marcus had learned in France that the key to successful defense was creating overlapping zones of fire that left no safe approach for attackers. Every tree, every building, every natural depression had been evaluated for its tactical value. Isaiah had spent the morning turning his blacksmith shop into an armory, crafting additional ammunition and sharpening blades. His son David worked beside him, their hammers ringing in rhythm as they prepared for war. The forge glowed white-hot as Isaiah worked to produce bullets, arrowheads, and improvised weapons. His massive hands shaped metal with the same skill he'd used to create horseshoes and farming tools, but now his products were designed for killing rather than creation. David, drawing on his experience with the 369th, helped to modify existing weapons for maximum effectiveness. The women of the community had organized their own preparations. Martha Washington led a group that included the settlement's nurse, teacher, and midwife in converting the villa's basement into a medical station. They'd stockpiled bandages, antiseptic, and morphine, preparing for casualties they prayed would never come. The medical preparations were as thorough as the military ones. Martha had assisted the settlement's doctor for years and had learned to treat everything from broken bones to gunshot wounds. The basement had been chosen for its protection from stray bullets and its multiple exits in case evacuation became necessary. As the afternoon wore on, scouts began reporting increased activity in the surrounding area. Jerome, positioned on the highest hill overlooking the valley, signaled that large groups of riders were converging from multiple directions. Benjamin, watching the southern approach, counted at least 20 men gathering near the old Miller plantation. The signals were simple but effective: mirror flashes during the day, lantern blinks at night. Each scout had been given specific codes to communicate numbers, direction, and urgency. The system allowed the defenders to track enemy movements without revealing their own positions. "They're taking their time," Marcus observed, studying the reports. "Building up their numbers, making sure they have overwhelming force." Thomas nodded grimly. "Whitmore's no fool. He knows we're not going to run, so he's making sure he has enough men to finish this in one assault." The tactical situation was becoming clear. Whitmore was gathering forces from across the county, calling in favors, and promising rewards to men who shared his hatred. He was planning a single overwhelming attack designed to crush resistance before it could organize. As evening approached, the final count became clear. Jerome's signals indicated that approximately 60 armed men had gathered in the hills surrounding Freedman's Haven. They'd brought torches, rope, and enough firepower to level the entire settlement. The numbers were sobering: 60 attackers against 14 defenders, odds of more than 4 to 1. But Marcus had learned in France that numbers weren't everything. Discipline, training, and the advantage of defensive positions could offset numerical superiority. The key was to make the attackers pay such a high price that their will to fight would break. Samuel gathered the defenders in the villa's main room for what might be their final meeting. The faces around him showed fear. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid, but also determination. These were men who'd faced death before, in different wars and different times, but always for the same cause. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as Samuel prepared to speak. The portraits of ancestors looked down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge the living. The furniture, crafted by free hands, bore witness to what could be lost. The books on the shelves represented knowledge gained and wisdom earned through struggle. "Gentlemen," Samuel began, "I want each of you to know that you have a choice, even now. Anyone who wants to slip away in the darkness, take their family and go. There's no shame in it. You've already done more than anyone had a right to ask." Not a single man moved. The silence that followed was profound and meaningful. Each man had made his choice, and each was prepared to live or die with the consequences. They understood that this moment would define not just their own lives, but the future of their community and their children. "All right then," Samuel continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. "Let's talk about how we're going to make them pay for every inch of ground." Marcus outlined the defensive plan one final time. The outer perimeter would be held by the most experienced marksmen, positioned to slow the initial assault and force the attackers into predetermined kill zones. The villa itself would serve as the final stronghold, with the Lewis gun providing covering fire for any retreat. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The defenders would fight a delaying action, falling back from position to position while inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. Each defensive line was designed to channel the enemy into areas where they could be engaged most effectively. "Remember," Marcus emphasized, "we're not trying to win a conventional battle. We're trying to make this so costly that they'll think twice before attacking another community like ours." Thomas added his own tactical wisdom. "These aren't soldiers. They're a mob. They're counting on us to break and run when they charge. When we don't, when they start taking casualties, some of them will lose their nerve." The psychology of mob violence was something Thomas understood from his cavalry days. He'd seen how quickly a confident attack could turn into a panicked retreat when faced with determined resistance. The key was to break their momentum early and make them pay a price they hadn't expected. Professor Hayes had prepared a different kind of weapon, a detailed account of the settlement's history, the legal documents proving their ownership of the land, and testimonies from each family about their lives and dreams. He'd hidden copies in multiple locations, ensuring that if they didn't survive the night, their story would. "History will remember what happens here," he told the assembled men. "Whether we live or die, people will know that we stood up, that we fought back, that we refused to accept that the color of our skin made us less than human." The historical record was as important as the tactical one. Hayes understood that their struggle was part of a larger story, the ongoing fight for human dignity and equality. Win or lose, their resistance would inspire others and contribute to the eventual triumph of justice. As full darkness fell, the defenders took their positions. Marcus kissed his grandmother goodbye and made his way to the forward observation post he'd chosen near the main road. Thomas positioned himself with the Lewis gun, his cavalry experience making him the natural choice to operate the weapon. Isaiah and David took positions flanking the villa's main entrance, their rifles loaded and ready. The night was unusually quiet, as if even the insects and nightbirds sensed the approaching violence. A thin crescent moon provided just enough light to see movement, but not enough to make accurate shooting easy, an advantage that would favor the defenders, who knew every inch of their terrain. At 11:47 p.m., Jerome's signal came from the hilltop, 3 quick flashes of his lantern, followed by 2 more. The enemy was moving. Marcus felt his heart rate slow and his breathing become controlled, the automatic response of a combat veteran preparing for battle. Around him he could sense, rather than see, his fellow defenders making their own final preparations. Safeties clicked off. Bolts were worked to chamber rounds. Prayers were whispered into the darkness. In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats began to echo through the valley, growing steadily louder. Torches appeared on the hillsides like malevolent stars, and the night air carried the sound of voices raised in hatred and anticipation. Clayton Whitmore had returned, and he'd brought an army. But as Marcus settled his rifle against his shoulder and took aim at the approaching torches, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, but a strange sense of peace. He'd fought for democracy in France, and now he was fighting for it at home. He'd worn his country's uniform with pride, and now he was defending the principles that uniform represented. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he would face it as a free man in defense of free people, on free soil that they'd bought with their own blood and sweat. The war for Freedman's Haven was about to begin. The attack came with the fury of a summer storm, sudden and overwhelming. Whitmore's mob charged down the main road in a thunderous cavalcade of horses, torches, and rebel yells that echoed off the surrounding hills. They'd expected to find a sleeping settlement, defenseless families cowering in their beds, easy targets for their particular brand of terror. Instead, they rode into hell. The first indication that something was wrong came when the lead riders noticed the absence of lights in the settlement. No lanterns glowed in windows, no fires burned in hearths, no signs of normal evening activity. The silence was unnatural, ominous, like the calm before a tornado strikes. But by then, momentum and hatred had carried them too far to stop. Marcus held his fire until the lead riders were less than 50 yards away, close enough to see the hatred in their eyes, close enough to hear their individual voices raised in bloodthirsty anticipation. Then he squeezed the trigger of his Springfield rifle, and the night exploded into violence. His shot took Whitmore's lieutenant, a man named Briggs who owned the largest mill in the county, square in the chest, toppling him from his horse in a spray of blood. The animal reared and screamed, throwing the charge into momentary confusion. Briggs had been Whitmore's enforcer for years, a man who took pleasure in intimidating black families and burning their homes. His death sent a shock through the attacking mob. They'd expected easy victims, not disciplined resistance. The sight of their leader's right-hand man dying in the dirt was their first indication that this night would not go as planned. That moment was all the defenders needed. From positions carefully chosen and prepared throughout the afternoon, the veterans of Freedman's Haven opened fire with the disciplined precision of men who'd learned their trade in the trenches of France and the battlefields of the Civil War. Each shot was aimed, each bullet found its mark, and the night filled with the screams of wounded men and terrified horses. The defensive positions had been chosen with mathematical precision. Each rifleman had clear fields of fire, predetermined ranges, and backup positions to fall back to when necessary. The interlocking zones of fire created a deadly gauntlet that no cavalry charge could survive intact. Thomas opened up with the Lewis gun from the villa's second-story window, the weapon's distinctive chatter cutting through the chaos like a mechanical scythe. The interlocking fields of fire that Marcus had planned worked exactly as intended, catching the attackers in a deadly crossfire that turned their charge into a slaughter. The Lewis gun was positioned to command the main approach road, and Thomas used it with devastating effect. His cavalry experience had taught him to lead moving targets, and his steady hands sent streams of bullets into the packed ranks of riders. Horses and men went down in tangled heaps, creating obstacles that further disrupted the charge. "Fall back! Fall back!" Whitmore's voice rose above the gunfire, but his men were already breaking, their courage evaporating in the face of disciplined resistance they hadn't expected. The psychological impact of the defensive fire was as important as its physical effect. The attackers had expected to face frightened civilians, not trained soldiers. The precision and discipline of the resistance shattered their confidence and turned their attack into a rout. But the mob had numbers, and hatred has its own momentum. Even as the first wave retreated, Leaving behind 6 dead and twice as many wounded, Whitmore was rallying his forces for a second assault. "They can't have that many guns," he screamed at his followers. "It's just a handful of uppity niggers. We outnumber them 10 to 1. Whitmore's desperation was evident in his voice. He'd promised his followers an easy victory, a chance to put uppity coloureds back in their place. The fierce resistance was not only unexpected, it was humiliating. His reputation as a leader depended on delivering the violence he'd promised. The second attack came from multiple directions, with groups of riders attempting to flank the settlement, while others provided covering fire from the hills. It was a more sophisticated assault, and it nearly succeeded. Jerome, holding the southern perimeter alone, found himself facing 8 mounted men charging his position simultaneously. His first shot dropped the lead rider, but the others kept coming. He worked the bolt of his rifle with desperate speed, firing and reloading with the mechanical precision drilled into him during his service with the 371st Infantry. Jerome's position was a natural depression behind a fallen oak tree, chosen for its commanding view of the southern approach. But the cover that protected him from frontal assault left him vulnerable to flanking movements. He could hear hoofbeats approaching from multiple directions and knew he was about to be overrun. His second shot missed. His third took down another horse, sending its rider tumbling into the darkness. But the remaining attackers were too close, and Jerome knew he was about to be overrun. That's when David appeared out of the darkness like an avenging angel, his rifle spitting fire as he charged into the melee. The blacksmith's son had inherited his father's massive frame and his grandfather's courage, and he used both to devastating effect. His bayonet work was brutal and efficient, learned in the close-quarters fighting of the Argonne Forest. David's arrival turned the tide of the southern assault. His experience with the 369th Infantry had taught him the value of aggressive counterattacks, and he used that knowledge to devastating effect. His bayonet, fixed to his Springfield rifle, became a weapon of terrible efficiency in the close-quarters fighting. Together, Jerome and David held the southern approach, but at a terrible cost. Jerome took a bullet in the shoulder that shattered bone and left his right arm useless. David caught a saber cut across his ribs that opened him up from armpit to hip. The wounds were serious, but not immediately fatal. Jerome's shoulder would heal, though he'd never have full use of his right arm again. David's ribs would mend, but the scar would serve as a permanent reminder of the night when free men stood up to hatred and won. The villa itself came under direct assault as a group of attackers managed to reach the front porch. Isaiah met them at the door with a shotgun in one hand and a hammer in the other, his massive frame filling the doorway like an immovable mountain. The first man through the door lost his head to the hammer. The second took both barrels of the shotgun at point-blank range. Isaiah's defense of the villa's entrance became the stuff of legend. At 68 years old, he fought with the fury of a man half his age, using every weapon at his disposal. His blacksmith's hammer, wielded with the strength of decades at the forge, crushed skulls and shattered bones. His shotgun, loaded with homemade buckshot, turned the doorway into a killing ground. But Isaiah was 68 years old, and the young men he faced were driven by fanatical hatred. A knife found its way between his ribs, and the old veteran went down fighting, taking 2 more attackers with him. Isaiah's death was a blow to the defenders, but his sacrifice had saved the villa from being overrun. His body blocked the doorway, forcing attackers to climb over their own dead to reach the interior. The delay gave other defenders time to reposition and continue the fight. From the second floor, Thomas continued to work the Lewis gun with deadly efficiency, but he could see that the defensive perimeter was beginning to collapse. Too many good men were down, and Whitmore still had overwhelming numbers. "Marcus!" he shouted down to the main floor. "We need to fall back to the house." But Marcus was already moving, helping to carry the wounded Jerome toward the villa while laying down covering fire with his pistol. Professor Hayes appeared from the basement, his scholarly demeanor replaced by the grim efficiency of a man doing what needed to be done. He'd armed himself with one of Isaiah's hunting rifles and was proving surprisingly effective with it. Hayes had never been a soldier, but he'd studied military history and understood the principles of defensive warfare. His shots were carefully aimed and devastatingly accurate, each bullet finding its mark with scholarly precision. His calm demeanor under fire inspired the other defenders and helped maintain discipline in the chaos of battle. The battle raged for 3 hours, from midnight until nearly dawn. Wave after wave of attackers threw themselves against the defenders of Freedman's Haven, and each wave was thrown back with terrible losses. The settlement's buildings caught fire from the torches, filling the night with smoke and the smell of burning wood. The fires added a hellish dimension to the battle. Smoke obscured vision and made breathing difficult, while the flickering light created dancing shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The defenders had to fight not only human enemies, but also the threat of being burned alive in their own homes. But the defenders were taking casualties too. Benjamin fell to a sniper's bullet while trying to reach the wounded David. Robert took a shotgun blast that left him alive but crippled for life. Professor Hayes caught a rifle round in the leg that would leave him with a permanent limp. Each casualty was a personal loss for the small community. These weren't anonymous soldiers dying for abstract principles. They were friends, neighbors, family members who'd chosen to stand and fight rather than flee. Their sacrifice gave meaning to the resistance and strengthened the resolve of the survivors. As dawn began to break over the valley, painting the smoke-filled air in shades of red and gold, the surviving attackers finally began to withdraw. They'd lost nearly half their number, 26 men dead, and 15 more wounded so badly they'd never fight again. The cost had been too high, even for hatred. The withdrawal wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. The survivors fled in panic, abandoning their wounded and leaving behind weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. The disciplined resistance had broken their will to fight and shattered their belief in their own superiority. Whitmore himself lay among the dead, brought down by a shot from Thomas's Lewis gun as he'd tried to rally his men for one final assault. His expensive clothes were soaked with blood, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the sky he'd never see again. Whitmore's death marked the end of organized resistance to Freedman's Haven. Without his leadership and financial backing, the scattered remnants of his followers lacked the cohesion to mount another attack. His body, lying in the dirt he'd sought to reclaim, became a symbol of the failure of hatred to triumph over courage. The defenders had paid their own price. Isaiah was dead, his massive frame still guarding the villa's front door. Benjamin was gone, cut down while trying to save a friend. Jerome would live, but his fighting days were over. David would carry scars for the rest of his life, both visible and invisible, but they had won. As the sun rose fully over Freedman's Haven, Samuel Washington stood on his bullet-scarred porch and surveyed what remained of his dream. Half the buildings were damaged or destroyed. The school where children had learned to read was a smoking ruin. The workshop where Isaiah had crafted tools and weapons was a pile of ash and twisted metal. The physical damage was extensive but not irreparable. Buildings could be rebuilt, tools could be replaced, and books could be repurchased. But the human cost, the friends and neighbors who died defending their homes, could never be recovered. Their sacrifice had purchased victory, but the price had been terrible. But the villa still stood, the people still lived, and the deed to the land was still in Samuel's pocket, signed and legal, and unburned. Marcus limped up the porch steps, his uniform torn and blood-stained, his face bearing the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much death. But when he looked at his grandfather, his eyes were clear. "We did it, Papa Sam. We held them off." Samuel nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Yes, boy, we did. But this isn't over. There'll be others someday. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday." The victory was complete, but not final. Hatred didn't die with Whitmore. It would find new leaders, new followers, new excuses for violence. The price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and the people of Freedman's Haven had learned that lesson in blood. "Then we'll be ready for them too," Marcus replied. "We'll rebuild what they burned, and we'll teach our children to shoot straight and stand tall. And if they come again, we'll remind them what it costs to attack free people on free soil." Professor Hayes emerged from the villa, his wounded leg wrapped in bandages, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents. "I've written it all down," he announced. "Every detail, every name, every act of courage. This story will be told, and it will be remembered." The historical record was as important as the military victory. Hayes understood that their struggle was part of a larger story, the ongoing fight for human dignity and equality. Their resistance would inspire others and contribute to the eventual triumph of justice. Thomas appeared in the doorway, the Lewis gun broken down and slung over his shoulder. His cavalry instincts had served